So let me start the screen share. And okay, let's see here. There we go. Okay, now it's working. Okay, welcome back. We are finishing up today and next week our presentations on Egypt in ancient history and the Bible. And remember, Egypt is kind of divided up into three basic periods of time. We've got the Old Kingdom, which is sometimes called the Pyramid Age. And then there's the age called the Middle Kingdom, which was kind of separated by an intercession period where we had Abraham come into Egypt and do his thing with the Pharaoh. And then we had a period called the Middle Kingdom, which is the period of time when Joseph was in the Bible. And there wasn't a lot of big things happen, not like the Pyramid Age where they built the pyramids of Giza, or the New Kingdom where they built a lot of temples and famous, ruins are left over. But it is the period of time when Joseph was in the Bible and in Egypt. And then Egypt was invaded by a group of kind of mysterious people called the Hyksos, which were probably Canaanites. And they came in and kind of disrupted Egypt for a short period of time. And then when we left off, Egypt was reunited under a king by the name of Ahmose I. And then last week, we kind of took a sidelight journey and talked about Egyptian religion, because number one, it's so interesting. And number two, it does have an impact on how the Egyptian kings were able to gain such power over their people. But today and next week, we're going to talk about the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom is the largest period of time in Egyptian history. It lasted approximately 1,500 years, almost half of the 3,000 years of the Egyptian dynasties. It also is a period of time when we had some of the most important kings, which were then becoming known as pharaohs. They weren't called pharaohs until the New Kingdom, although we generally apply that term now to all kings of Egypt. And so we're going to talk for the next couple of weeks about the New Kingdom. Pardon me, I think that's my wife's phone going off. Okay, so what did we learn last week? Well, we learned that Egyptian religion was polytheistic, animistic, and anthropomorphic, just like the most ancient religions were. We learned about Egypt's creation myth that culminated in the cult of Osiris, Isis, Set, and Horus. And we learned that Egypt had hundreds, maybe thousands of gods. They had more gods than you could shake a stick at, as we used to say in the hills. We learned that Egypt had a strong belief in the afterlife and that their life was centered around their preparation for death. It was just all, it's what they did for almost all their life, was prepare for death. We learned about the mummification processes, and we learned that it was through this process of religion that the Pharaoh and the priests were able to keep control of the people by the use of festivals, temple worship, etc. So my cartoon for the day, I love this cartoon. We've got Moses and the Hebrews going through the Red Sea, the Reed Sea, whatever it was, and you got some of the young ones surfing. They say, "You kids, settle down. This is serious business." This is one of my favorite cartoons. So, Bible verse for the day. The new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. So they put okay, I've lost part of it here. So they put slave masters over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramesses store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. And then the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. Exodus 1:8-13. This, of course, is the foundation of the Exodus period when Moses took the Hebrews out of Egypt. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. We're going to talk about Moses, because this is the period of time of the early part of the New Kingdom when Moses did his thing in Egypt. So the New Kingdom is generally classified as being 1550 BC to about 1077 BC. That's a little off, because actually the next 1,000 years is a period of time when Egypt suffered through, I guess, what you'd call being a vassal state by different rulers like the Assyrians and then the Persians and then the Romans. But really, Egypt continued on with their kings. So, with the expulsion of the Hyksos rulers by Ahmose I in the mid-16th century, Egypt once again came under control of a single ruler. As we said, Egypt had been invaded by this mysterious group of people called the Hyksos, and they ruled for about 150, 200 years or so in Egypt. Well, I say ruled, they were in control of parts of it, the northern part, Lower Egypt. And then the Egyptians united again under this Ahmose Pharaoh and pushed them out. The rulers of the 18th and 19th dynasties of Egypt ruled the country during this prosperous time and marked the peak of power. It was during this period of time, between 1550 and about 1077, that Egypt reached its height of power. I mean, it was the strongest superpower in the world. It controlled all the known Western world at that time. And it was primarily ruled by two dynasties, the 18th and the 19th. And some of the most famous pharaohs of Egyptian history occurred during this period of time. As I mentioned, it was during this period of time that the kings took on a new name, Pharaoh, which actually was the name of their palace. Their palace was called the Great House, which in Egypt translated to Pharaoh. And eventually, the name became applied to the king himself. And as a result, we now know most kings of Egypt during this Egyptian period of ancient history, we call them pharaohs. Egypt also pushed its borders to its greatest limits during the New Kingdom in an attempt to create a buffer from the Levant and the Baal Asiatics that they basically extended their limits clear up to the Euphrates River to the north. So they learned their lesson from the Hyksos invasion. They said, we're not going to let this happen again if we can keep from it. And so they basically invaded what we now know as Israel, Jordan, all this area of Syria and Iraq, and this area up in there, the Levant and the northern part of the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. And they secured these in an attempt to create a buffer state. A buffer state is one that kind of separates you from possible enemies. And they thought, we will create this buffer state and we will control this area so we will never again be invaded by these, and they called them vile Asiatics. So eventually, this brought them into conflict with the Hittites for control of modern day Syria. And it was during this period of time that we had one of the most famous battles of ancient history, the Battle of Kadesh, which we talked about when we talked about the Hittites, but we'll kind of talk about it again a little bit. And to the south, they pushed their borders clear into what we now know as Sudan. Then it was called Nubia, in an attempt to halt the attacks from the powerful Cushites, which had plagued Egypt for a long time. And so they just basically spread their kingdom all around. And this is a bust of Ahmose I. Not very good. It's kind of broken up. And you'll notice that he's not wearing the dual crown that we talked about from the beginning, the red and white crown of Egypt. He's only wearing the crown of Upper Egypt because apparently when this bust was made, he had not yet reunified Egypt under his power. So we're going to talk about the 18th dynasty today and next week mostly. And the 18th dynasty is just loaded with famous pharaohs. We've already mentioned Ahmose. You've also had Hatshepsut, one of the really unique rulers in the ancient world. She was a woman. We're going to talk about Thutmose III, who was probably the great warrior king of Egypt. We'll talk about Akhenaten, who tried to start a religious revolution in Egypt. Didn't last. And of course, we'll talk about Tutankhamun, King Tut, and Ramesses II. All of these are just really famous kings. As we've seen, Ahmose I was the king who successfully rid Egypt of the Hyksos rulers, consolidated the country under his power. And so Ahmose kicks out the Hyksos. He reasserted Egyptian power in the former territories of Nubia and the Levant, reopened the quarries, the mines, trade routes, and he also began a lot of massive construction projects, which led to the last pyramids being built by native Egyptian rulers. They're nowhere near as big as the pyramids of Giza, but they still remain. The remains of the pyramids were found at Abydos, another little city. Unfortunately, it's not much left of it. It's just been reduced by grave robbers to basically a mound of rubble. Ahmose was followed by a couple of pharaohs called Amenhotep I and Thutmose I, who just extended the boundaries even further, clear up to the Euphrates River. Finally, you've got a pharaoh called Thutmose II, who we're going to talk about here quite a little bit, who was married to his half-sister, Hatshepsut, who we'll talk about a lot. And then their son, Thutmose III, became a pharaoh at the age of 2, but he didn't get to really rule for 22 years because his mother, stepmother, aunt, whatever she was, kind of usurped the throne and took over for him since he was just an infant of 2 years old. And she ruled as a woman pharaoh, very unique. So those are the pharaohs we're basically going to talk about today. We're going to concentrate on Hatshepsut and Thutmose III because they're very, very important. And here is a map of Egypt during the New Kingdom. You can see it covered all of the old traditional Nile River Valley, clear out into the Sudan, down here, and out into what we now call Libya. Covered all the Sinai, all of what we call Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Phoenicia, all these areas, Syria, clear up into the Syrian, the old Assyrian lands. It didn't cover the southern part of the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, which was basically made up, first of all, of Assyria and then Babylonia and later on the Persians. We talked about this. It also didn't cover the area of what we call present-day Turkey, which was ruled then by the Hittites. So this was a huge area, folks. And they did this to create buffer zones, I've said, so they wouldn't be so scared of being invaded again. So let's talk about Hatshepsut. She is an absolutely fascinating character. Hatshepsut was only the second historically confirmed female pharaoh, and without a doubt the most powerful. I don't even know who the other one was, I'll be honest with you. Her bloodline allowed her to be pharaoh since she was the daughter, the sister, and the wife of a king. She had quite the pedigree. Remember, the pharaohs, the kings of Egypt, interbred with their sisters. There's been an occasion where they interbred with their mothers. It sounds completely gross to us, but this was how they felt like it had to be done because the king, the pharaoh, was divine, and so he could only continue that divinity if he married another divine person, which had to be a blood relative. Hatshepsut is generally called the first great woman in history of whom we are informed, according to an Egyptologist who was very famous, named was James Breaston. So Hatshepsut is one of the really, really powerful people of Egypt. During her 22-year reign, she reestablished many of the trade routes disrupted by the Hyksos. She rebuilt much of Egypt's wealth. She is most noted for starting a trade expedition to the kingdom of Punt, which I believe is where we now know as Yemen. And it was noteworthy in that she first recorded an attempt to transplant myrrh trees, which are still found on the grounds of her mortuary temple. This is one of the instances where they brought in foreign trees and replanted them in Egypt. Mostly you have palm trees in Egypt, but she tried to bring in foreign trees. She also is one of Egypt's most prolific builders. She built temples at the old religious center of Karnak, which had twin obelisks, and one of them still stands. And at that time, they were still the tallest obelisk in the world. An obelisk is something similar. Well, it is exactly like the Washington Monument. The Washington Monument is an obelisk. It's a very tall, thin, narrow temple of a sort, a monument that was a monument to her. Without a doubt, though, the masterpiece of her construction was her mortuary temple in the Valley of the Kings. She started building her tomb in the Valley of the Kings, which was kind of an isolated valley. They had figured out that it didn't do any good to build their tombs at big, lavish monuments, because if you did that, they were going to get robbed. And so they started building their tombs out in kind of no man's land called the Valley of the Kings. Her mortuary temple is just absolutely spectacular. I will show you a picture of it here in a moment. And it is so modern looking that it literally, I've had people, when I've showed this to them in the class that I teach here, they thought it was new. They thought it was something that had been built in the 20th century. It is so modern looking and so harmonious with the background that it just doesn't look, 4,000 years old. During her reign, Hatshepsut assumed all the regalia and the symbols of pharaonic rule. And as she progressed over this 22-year period, when she first became pharaoh and they did sculptures of her, she's clearly a female, as you'll see. But the longer she ruled, the more she resembled a man. They portray her with a beard. Her features become much more masculine looking. And as a result, she kind of basically, this was her way of demonstrating to the people that she was a genuine pharaoh, because I'm sure they didn't think a woman could be pharaoh. And so she had to demonstrate to them that she was kind of transitioning into a male. I know that sounds like something out of the modern times, and she didn't really transition into a male. She just took on the look of one, so she could be the pharaoh. We don't know exactly how old she was when she died, or how she died. Probably died of diabetes and bone cancer, but we're not really for sure. Probably died somewhere in her 50s. So she ruled for about 22 years. She would have assumed the throne in the late 20s, her late 20s or early 30s, and then ruled for 22 years as a co-regent for her son or her stepson. Her tomb in the now called Valley of the Kings was the first in that area and became the burial ground for a lot of other pharaohs later on. So this is her mortuary temple. This is the temple I was talking to you about. Now you can see that this part has been reconstructed. This is new. The steps up to the second and the third colonnade. This is all original, and you can see parts of it over here have been destroyed through different things. It probably matched this over here, but you can see there's been a little bit of reconstruction here. But for the most part, folks, this is totally the way it looked. And it is just, like I said, I just get amazed when I look at this, because it just doesn't look 4,000 years old. It was built into the side of a cliff, and it would have been this temple where she was buried and where all the mortuary stuff took place during her funeral part. So this is a couple of sculptures of Hatshepsut. This is an early sculpture. You can tell she's clearly a woman. Um, she obviously is a woman here, and you can tell that she has kind of feminine-like features in her face, the full lips, and just she looks like a woman. This would have been a sculpture from the later period. Now she's a little bit more masculine looking, a little bit more muscular, a little bit firmer, a little bit more square jawed. She had a beard, which was common, um, and she's just taken on a totally different look besides just age. She's taken on a look of a male. And this was to kind of, make sure that the people understood that she was the Pharaoh. So, as I said, she actually ruled as co-regent for these 22 years with her stepson, who became Thutmose III. He finally gained the throne when she died. Now, there for a long time period, historians thought that probably he didn't like his stepmother and he was very upset about this. I'm not for sure that that's true, because while he was alive and ruling as co-regent with her, he was actually put in charge of the military most of his adolescent years. I don't think Hatshepsut, if she would have mistrusted him, would have allowed him to be in charge of the military, because that would have been if he didn't like her and he didn't trust her, that would have been a sure way to make sure that he took power of the throne. So I think probably there wasn't the bad relationship necessarily between Thutmose III and his stepmother as has been portrayed. So, this was one of those things. He is generally considered to be one of the greatest pharaohs of Egyptian history. He was most definitely the most militaristic. Uh, During his reign, basically of 20 years, he had 17 foreign campaigns. He waged war almost the whole time he was pharaoh. It was he who spread this empire out and began to create all this buffer zone that I've talked about. In fact, the case James Breasted, again, one of the great Egyptologists, called him the Napoleon of Egypt. He said he was such a military genius, and they've studied his military campaigns, and they still study him. They are still taught in some of the military academies around the world. I'm not sure if they're taught in America, but they are definitely taught in some of the military academies around the world, where they study the way he waged his wars and his battles, because they were so strategically uh, innovative. He's considered the greatest of Egypt's warrior pharaohs who transformed Egypt into an international superpower. There was nothing like it up to this point. Up to this point, even though there had been other kingdoms which had covered lots of land and been in charge for short periods of time, it was under him that Egypt just absolutely created the concept of a superpower. Now, he wasn't the last one. The Persians came along and did the same thing. And then, of course, the greatest of all, the Romans came along and did the same thing. So, he wasn't the last one, but he was probably the first real superpower king that you could call in the ancient world. Now, we know a lot about Thutmose III because his royal scribe, the man who wrote down all he did, he wrote down everything. And a lot of it has been engraved in the temples of Karnak on these columns. This is how we know it. They've been inscribed his battles and what he did. And we know probably more about Thutmose III than any other Egyptian pharaoh, because he ruled with this scribe. You'll notice up here, we even know the dates, the day and the month in which he lived and died. Very unusual. Even later on, we don't know that about most ancient kings and all. But we know so much about him because of this royal scribe that wrote down all of his life. His ability to conquer his enemies was due partially from the adoption of the horse-drawn chariot that he adapted from the Hyksos invaders. Remember, the Egyptians, for all their technology skills, were slow to get the concept of the wheel. And so he was able to bring this together, and he adapted the chariot, and it became a weapon of power under his rule. His first military campaign resulted in the Battle of Megiddo in the Levant area of the Canaan, where he basically defeated the Canaanite forces. And this battle changed the political situation in the ancient Near East, where he basically defeated the Hittites and the Babylonians and the Canaanites, and they were forced to send tribute to Thutmose III. He let them keep their countries, but he said, you have to be a vassal state to me now. You owe me money every year, and you have to have allegiance to me.
What?
Military campaigns,
Yep.
all in the Levant. He did a lot of warfare in the Levant area because this was where he thought the greatest threat would come from. Uh, he also did some down in the south, like I said, the Nubians. He was also a prolific builder. He built over 50 temples, most of which are lost. Um, he did rebuilt the hypostolic hall that his grandfather Thutmose I had built at Karnak, which is one of the famous temples that I think I've showed you pictures of last week during the when we talked about religion. He also reportedly built a botanical garden at Thebes. It, of course, no longer exists. But again, it was kind of the thing during this period of time. Remember the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, and we also had Assyria also had some botanical type gardens. So it must have been kind of a thing during this period of time to build botanical gardens. Towards the end of his reign, there began a campaign to kind of deface and destroy many of the monuments built by Hatshepsut. So all of a sudden, we begin to see monuments that they would chip off the words and erase her name off the engravings and destroy some of the sculptures. And for a long time, it was thought that it was him who had done this. We kind of think now it was more his son, Amenhotep II, because he remembered what had happened to his father from his grandmother. And he thought, I don't want this to have happened to me. So I'm going to destroy as much as I can my grandmother's image, her name. So I will make sure that there's not an attempt to basically have the same kind of thing. He was probably a little bit of uh, what we would probably call a misogynist. He was probably one of these people that didn't particularly care much for women, except as you know necessary to breed. So this is a sculpture of Thutmose III, one of the most famous sculptors of Egypt. You can see that he has this portrayal as what we would generally think of as an Egyptian pharaoh. He looks like an Egyptian pharaoh. This is what we think of when we see one. Okay, this is the plains of Megiddo. You probably know it better as the site where in the Bible says the last battle will take place of Armageddon. This is where the Bible says the great battle when Jesus comes back to earth and takes control of earth, that there will be one last huge battle here with the forces of Satan at the battle plains in Megiddo, which is now known as Armageddon. And so this is the plains of Megiddo where Thutmose III had his great battle against the Hittites. Now, as I mentioned, his son was Amenhotep II, and he is just about as powerful as his dad. He wasn't the warrior that his dad was, but he was a very powerful pharaoh in his own right. He came to power because his oldest brother, Prince Amenhotep, died in early in life. I want you to remember that because that's really important for something down the line here, as we'll talk about in a minute. He served the co-regency with Thutmose III over 2 years, during which time he was made high priest over Lower Egypt, oversaw construction projects, kind of this was a thing, co-regency during this period of time in the New Kingdom. He reigned for 26 years. thought to have died in his early 40s. He didn't live a long time. Uh, it's ironic that he was known for his physical prowess. All the engravings about his life talk about all the great deeds he did as a person. Supposedly, he wrestled a lion and killed it, and all these different things. And yet, he wasn't the military man that his father was. He didn't wage a whole lot of campaigns. What he did was, as I said, he kind of went on a campaign to remove the monuments and tributes to his grandmother, uh, probably because he feared another woman. He didn't want another woman sitting on the throne. It's also notable they did not record the names of his queens. Again, he kind of wanted to play down the power of a woman during this period of time because he obviously felt like, he had learned his lesson, even if his dad hadn't. He died in 1401. He was buried in a secret tomb in the Valley of the Kings. And, we eventually did find it, and it was robbed, just like every other tomb of every other Pharaoh was robbed. Every tomb of every Pharaoh we found has been robbed, except for one. And we're going to talk about him next week. That's the famous King Tut. So this is Amenhotep II. Now, let's talk about Moses. We know the story of Moses. We know that Moses was, according to the Bible, left in a reed basket in the Nile River, and that he was found by the daughter of Pharaoh. And then he was actually sent back to be raised by his mother, which was, kind of like a wet nurse in the Pharaoh's daughter's eyes. And then he became basically like a son to Pharaoh. He was raised up as a son almost with Pharaoh and became very powerful. And then, of course, the Bible says he basically became aware of his lineage and became aware of the people of the Hebrew people. God opened his eyes and made him a deliverer of Egypt. And he challenged the Pharaoh to all these different things to let his people go. And eventually Pharaoh had to let him go. And we know the story. We've been through it. You read the Bible, you know it probably better than me. Now, there's been a long-standing debate is exactly who the Pharaoh of Moses was. And most scholars down through history have basically placed him in the reign of Ramesses II. We're going to talk about next week, who reigned from about 1301 to about 1224. That's no longer the way historians see it. They've changed their idea about when Moses was around. They think he actually ruled more in the time of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II, these two pharaohs we just talked about. Thutmose III was the great warrior king. Amenhotep II was his son. Thutmose III was raised by his mother, his stepmother, who would have been HATSHEPSUT. The reason is this. There's several reasons why we now think it was probably more Amenhotep II and Thutmose rather than Ramesses II. Most people believe that it was Ramesses because the Bible basically says in 1 Kings 6:1 that there was 480 years between the time of Moses and the building of the temple. Most people now say that's more of a symbolic number because they point to the Jubilee cycles in Jewish history, outlined in Leviticus. I'm not a Jewish scholar and I'm not a biblical scholar. I've read about the Jubilee cycles and I've got a kind of a vague idea about it. But basically, it's a record of the 51 years from which the temple was built. Every 50th year, 49th year, 50th year, they have what's called a Jubilee year because that's when all the slaves are freed. Everything kind of starts anew. And it's a huge deal in Jewish history. If you look at the Jubilee cycles from the period of time when the temple was built back, then Moses is placed not under Ramesses, he's placed under Amenhotep II, and that's the Pharaoh of who he challenged. So it's kind of a confusing thing. They also point to the fact that Amenhotep II was not the firstborn son, and he would have survived the 10th plague. Remember, Amenhotep II's brother was supposed to be the Pharaoh, and he died in youth. Also, Amenhotep's firstborn son, which we know for a fact, died as a young child. That makes sense because Amenhotep's son, the Pharaoh's son, died according to the Bible. Also, scholars point to the fact that Amenhotep's reign was a kind of a mysterious reversal of his father's foreign policy. Instead of gathering up new lands, he had to replace his army. His army suddenly seems to have disappeared. Makes sense because according to the Bible, most of the Pharaoh's army was destroyed at the debacle at the Red Sea. So his campaigns probably concentrated more on replacement of slaves and reconnaissance raids rather than military cycles. Another reason suspected Amenhotep II was the Pharaoh Moses, that is, inscriptions at Karnak focused on the spoils he plundered, specifically the number of slaves he brought back to Egypt. Remember, folks, when Moses left and the Hebrews left Egypt, it's over 500,000 people. We're not talking about just a few thousand here. We're talking about a huge number of people. Remember, the book of Numbers identifies each tribe and how many there was in it. And we're just talking about the men here. So it was at least 500,000 people. Somebody had to replace them because they were basically the labor force of Egypt. And once they left, then he had to concentrate on going out here gathering up slaves and bringing them to Egypt to replace the large number of those that had left. All these reasons kind of force historical scholars to kind of replace Ramesses with Amenhotep II as being the king, the Pharaoh of Moses. Finally, historical evidence points towards HATSHEPSUT as being the daughter of Pharaoh who found Moses. Again, this might play into the why Amenhotep II was so seemed to be so antagonistic against his grandmother. If indeed she was the one that raised up Moses, then Amenhotep would not have been happy with the fact that you've got this guy here that basically ruined his country and ruined his reputation as being raised up by his grandmother along with him. So he would have done everything he could to have gotten rid of his grandmother's name. It all makes sense when you think about it. So, of course, we've all seen the movie, The 10 Commandments. We got Charlton Heston as Moses. We've got Yul Brynner as the great Pharaoh and his father, who in the movie, Yul Brynner portrays himself as Ramses II, and his father would have been Seti. More than likely, Moses would have confronted Amenhotep II, who would have been the Yul Brynner character, and THUTMOSE III, who would have been the older Pharaoh seated. So it all kind of has been shifted around in the last few years. And this is in the historian, this is Bible scholars. I've talked to several Bible scholars, and they totally agree that probably is much more logical that the Pharaoh of Moses was not Ramesses, but was indeed Amenhotep II. So after this, you have some pretty insignificant pharaohs for a short period of time. We're not going to talk much about them. One of them was known as Amenhotep III. He was called the Magnificent, and he built Luxor, which was another huge temple. Just recently, we discovered the Metropolis, which was made up of all the workers around the outskirts of Luxor and Thebes. This is the big religious center of Egypt. And we're going to learn a whole lot more about the life of common people when these excavations are complete. they probably will not be completed in most of our lifetimes. We're talking 20, 25 years. I'm probably not going to be here. I'd like to be, but if I am, I probably won't know what they're talking about. I'm not going to lie to you. When he died, he left a country that was at the height of its power. I mean, Egypt was absolutely at the height of power around 1336 BC. But then Egypt was turned on its head because his son was a person who was supposed to have been called Amenhotep IV. In turn, he took the name Akhenaten, and he started a religious revolution that absolutely turned Egypt on its head. That's who we're going to talk about quite a bit next week, along with his probable son, which was King Tut. And so we're going to talk about these two next week. I'm going to show you some photographs of the treasures of King Tut, because remember, his is the only tomb which has been found that was unplundered. And he was such an insignificant pharaoh. He was just a boy when he died. When he was pharaoh, he became pharaoh when he was like 11 and died when he was 19. He only ruled for like 7 or 8 years. And he was so insignificant, did absolutely nothing. And yet his tomb was just loaded with treasures. If that was the case of the most insignificant pharaoh of Egypt, think about what these big pharaohs, what their tombs must have held. It's just amazing. So that's what we're going to talk about next week. We're going to talk about Akhenaten and the religious revival, religious revolution. We're talk about King Tut, and then we're going to talk a little bit about Ramesses II and see how Egypt's power came to an end. So we'll finish up with Egypt next week. So I appreciate you being with me. I thank you, and I'll turn it back to Caleb.